First of all, I'd like to mention that there's a reason why, or maybe more than one reason why feed additives matter for methane reduction. They are, in fact, a practical option for the near term. And so that's why there's so much excitement. And also there's a lot of excitement because research is being done and new results are coming up, on a weekly basis. So that is also very encouraging. There needs to be a little bit more explanation on why a feed additives guidance is required and why a tool is required. One of the main drivers for needing a guide and a tool to evaluate is that no two feed additives are alike. And therefore, it's important to understand all of these moving parts for every single one of the options that are going to be on the table. And also, because the dairy value chain has a wide variety of stakeholders, and all of them have different perspectives, and all of these different perspectives needs to be understood. The successful use of feed additives at scale requires them to meet a number of objectives for the dairy farm, but it also needs to satisfy the needs and expectations of those various stakeholders across the dairy supply chain. And so our methodology was pretty straightforward. Our main objective was to get a full representation of the value chain. We've listed the people that we've interviewed alphabetically. Every single one of you provided very valuable input that we took and synthesized in order to come up with results. As a reminder, we conducted those interviews by focusing on 4 different topics. We did this in order to have meaningful conversations. These are not necessarily exclusive, but there are some elements that play onto each other. And that's why we are talking about this as puzzle pieces that only make sense when they're all put together. You only get to see the picture when all of the different puzzle pieces are put together. So now I'm going to go onto the results, which is the most exciting portion of the presentation. Everybody understood that safety was number 1 for both the cow and the consumer, that methane reduction is number 2, and then that the trade-offs are number 3. And these elements are all extremely important if community adoption is going to take place. So now what I'm going to do is walk us through results for the 4 topics. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you 3 insights for each one of the topics and a summary slide. And then towards the end, I'm going to show which insights contributed to the evaluation tool and which insights were developed into best practices that are either currently available or best practices that need to be developed in the future. So let's start with safety for cows and consumers. The very first insight is that animal and food safety are non-negotiable. It's a deal breaker for all participants across the entire value chain. But it's really important to understand that in order to reach this element of animal and food safety, this requires evidence that the concentrations of potential residues in milk and meat resulting from feeding the additive are within the levels determined to be safe. Why do I point out on this? Because we're talking about concentration of compounds, right, being safe. And this brings us directly to insight number 2, which is that the safety element is based on composition and conditions of use. And why is this important? Because every feed additive is going to have a composition, but it must also have a conditions of use that is explained in detail. We are not only interested in the amounts of feed additive that are going to be administered, but we're also interested in the form in which they will be administered. How are they going to be fed? Is there going to be a period of acclimation, or is there going to be fed for a certain periods of time? I mean, all of those elements are elements that play onto the conditions of use. So safety is difficult because safety is confusing. It's confusing to the public, but it's also confusing even within the value chain. There is a requirement for FDA to approve feed additives, but there's also a GRAS exception. And so these designations of safety, either an FDA or a GRAS designation, are complicated because they're either a time-consuming process or there's a misconception that compounds found in nature are safe and require no evaluation. And that is simply not true, because every compound, which is the composition part of safety, needs to also come along with a conditions of use component. And so even natural compounds found in nature need to be evaluated for safety. The third insight in safety is pretty straightforward. The safety needs to also be maintained throughout the entire value chain. And there's people that are going to be handling these materials. They're going to likely be handling in different forms as the final form. And therefore, there needs to be a safety element throughout that process of handling as well. So having said all of that, I want to point out that the summary is that safety is the foundation for confidence, that we start from a place of confusion, but there is a risk of losing reputation that is non-negotiable. It's a deal breaker. And therefore, in order to maintain that confidence, safety needs to be number one. Let's jump on to the next element, which is efficacy. And here, our first insight is that the confidence on the reduction depends on the collective body of evidence and the quality of the evidence. And the key word here is collective. So this collective body of evidence and the quality of evidence in particular depends on the scientific rigor and depends on clearly defined conditions of use. So once again, why are conditions of use important? Because they also contribute to how the evidence is built on efficacy, on the reductions. It's important to understand, once again, the collective. The reliable body of evidence is required for all additives, once again, regardless of where they come from, if they're synthetic or if they're made from natural extracts. So understanding the collective is one thing, but what about the elements of that collective body of evidence? The fifth insight is that all study types play a role in evaluation, and therefore they all contribute to building that collective, and they contribute in different ways. So I took here an element from human medicine where the term efficacy defines the expected effects of any intervention under ideal or control conditions, and the term effectiveness defines the expected effects, but under commercial real-world conditions. Usually the example or analogy that I use that is pretty fresh in all our minds is the COVID vaccine. Laboratories developed the COVID vaccine. They tested efficacy in laboratory conditions, but the true effectiveness of the vaccine wasn't really observed until the vaccine was deployed in real populations with all the dynamics that occur in those real populations. We have the same thing here. So now we have a simplified inverted pyramid, which basically says that randomized controlled trials are the keystone for any body of evidence because they provide the evidence basis for efficacy. And they also help define conditions of use. Laboratory studies are useful screening tools and also mechanistic tools to understand how the reduction works. And commercial field trials are the ones that provide the measure of effectiveness that is relatable on the expected response under commercial conditions. Finally, all of this information can be synthesized into meta-analyses that brings all of that information together. It's important, however, to understand that a meta-analysis conducted up here with weak elements down here is going to reflect the elements right here. So depending on the strength of the elements, the randomized control trials, the lab studies, and the commercial field trials, it's what the meta-analysis is going to contribute. And finally, the sixth insight is that revaluation must be ongoing because evidence builds all the time. And so it's not a one and done deal. It's something that needs to happen again and again and again, particularly because as evaluation grows, not surprisingly, recommendations will change. And so we need to be open to change as new science builds up. So all types of studies matter. Control trials, like I said, are the keystone because that's the basis for efficacy. But all type of trials matter because they contribute differently to the collective, which is what we are interested in. We need to repeat this. You know, it's not we do a study and we're done. We've got all the answers.
The studies need to be conducted again and again and again until the collective gets better and better and better. And finally, a point that I want to point out is that most people within the value chain are not going to review the scientific evidence. So we got to figure out a way to communicate that collective to those folks so that they understand that the efficacy is there, so that they understand that the effectiveness is there. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the potential trade-offs and benefits. In this case, number one insight is that milk economic attributes must be protected. Not surprisingly, the trade-offs and benefits discussion is all about economics. We very quickly, in all of our discussions, went into all sorts of details when we were talking about trade-offs and benefits. You know, things that you find in this slide down at the bottom, things like milk production and composition, flavor, odor, consistency, cow health. I mean, you can see them all here listed in the screen. But at the end of the day, every single one of these elements under this particular aspect of trade-off and benefit is really an economic either driver, it's a benefit or a cost. And so that's why at the end of the day, we synthesize this to milk economic attributes must be protected. And so this one leads us to the next insight very seamlessly, because dairy farm ROI is a priority. This is the next iteration of the fact that we need to protect the economic attributes of milk, right? Now, dairy farm ROI being a priority is not only limited to milk, because there is potential for creating new value within this type of work. By feeding additives that reduce methane on dairy farms, there's an opportunity to create value that goes beyond milk, right? And so the dairy value chain, in terms of this, needs to understand and test some of these potential long-term compensation systems. And so short-term testing that could be done either through cost share, through the value chain, or even with involvement from the government, market premiums, and ecosystem services. These are all elements that can contribute to dairy farm ROI, and they need to be looked at. This brings us to the final insight, which I believe it's very important. Because we said that the milk economic attributes must be maintained, and then there's the priority to have a positive ROI on dairy farms. We need, as a collective value chain, to understand what is the market value, who contributes to creating that market value and also to the cost, and who benefits. So this one is an important one because there are three questions that we formulated that would hopefully help us in the future move forward. What are the economic values and costs associated to producing and marketing, for example, low methane milk or carbon credits? What contributions are necessary and who has to do them across the value chain to do that, to create that new value? And then finally, how are those economic values and costs incurred for being able to market these low methane milk or the carbon credits distributed across all those value chain contributors? I should have mentioned that as we start getting to trade-offs, and particularly when we go to adoption, there are no insights that really contribute to the tool. They contribute to best practices, and that's going to come to life when we get to those slides at the end. So the summary here is that benefits and trade-offs build the economic case. So there's an element of revenue here, and this element of revenue is an element of some of the already existing revenue streams, but also potential new revenue streams. There's also a need for understanding value and cost, and there's also a need for understanding reality. There are some trade-offs that we're going to have to address, and some trade-offs that maybe can be addressed differently and be taken out of the equation. And that's why I put this particular quote from Joan, because there are some trade-offs, in this case, the environmental trade-off, that right now exists completely outside of the economic environment. Finally, adoption by the dairy community. So, 3 insights. Number 1 is that adoption is challenging. And so I want to make a point here. We can very quickly jump to the bottom paragraph here and start thinking about all of these practical implementation barriers. I mean, we've been talking about this, a lot of us have. But even before we jump to the implementation barriers,
I think it's absolutely critical to understand and accept that individual actors within the value chain differ on what they're willing to accept on terms of safety, efficacy, and the trade-offs and benefits. This is critical. This is critical because some people are more willing to take risk. Some people are going to be less willing to take risk. We cannot, as a value chain, come together and standardize risk-taking. So I think this one is a critical insight to be understood from that perspective. The next one is that apparently 3 key factors are the ones that drive adoption. In this particular case, because the main function is to reduce enteric methane emissions, the ability to claim those reductions with confidence is number 1. Obviously, this depends on those efficacy elements that we talked about earlier, right? Then you have to have the ability to market those environmental benefits, either through carbon credits or through premium pricing, right? And you have to do that in simple and relatable terms. And that's the difficult part here. Simple and relatable terms. We're trying to explain why we have confidence. We're trying to explain it to people that are not going to look at the scientific evidence. And then finally, there's got to be some element of consumer endorsement and willingness to pay for the fact that these products are just superior to what they're being offered at the moment. Finally, the very final insight is that, not surprisingly, adoption requires full value chain collaboration. And there are 4 elements here that I pointed out. Why do we need the full value chain collaboration? Because the scientific consensus on evidence needs to be done without cutting corners that compromise the integrity for the full value chain. I mentioned, it sounds contradictory because I mentioned that different actors are willing to run different risks, but there are some risks, but we cannot run, right? Because the entire sector would be in trouble, right? And so for that purpose, there's some elements that we have to agree on. Collaboration between natural and social science are required because we need to address some of these attitude and behavioral factors for technology adoption that talks about addressing some of those barriers that I didn't want to delve on. The fact that all segments of the supply chain collaborate to co-create these adoption strategies, that means that, the economic value part of the collaboration is not only one actor that creates the value on their own. It requires collaboration across the supply chain. And then finally, the element that education and training is required from any really in the value chain to be able to make the options that they feel comfortable with, right? And so at this point in time, the summary for this basically is that clarity and motivation empower adoption. And this is primarily driven, it's got an element of collaboration that cannot be, underscored. We need clarity because we need to talk in simple and relatable terms. We need the motivation, but we need to understand all of the moving pieces because the value is really created from the collaboration. Having said all of that, here we are where we take all of these lessons learned and we apply what we learned into an evaluation tool. The evaluation tool is very, very simple. And as I mentioned, it takes elements from safety, efficacy, and trade-off and benefits, some of those insights, but it doesn't take insights from adoption. And you'll see why here in just a minute. The tool was basically developed to assist anybody that is faced with the question of, how do I feel about a certain additive, right? Or a number of additives that I need to evaluate to see how they match up with their standards for use. And so the tool, and also one other element is the tool is very US-centric. And you're going to notice it right here. 3 elements. The safety questionnaire has 3 questions and obviously talks specifically about FDA. So that's why I'm saying it's US-centric. Every piece of the tool has an element that reminds us of the insight. Animal and food safety are non-negotiable. Safety is established on the basis of composition and use, and safe handling is important for everybody. So you've got the 3 questions. Questions such as, has FDA reviewed and approved? If it's a yes, it obviously has more points than if it's a no. Number one is about the manufacturer reaching a GRAS conclusion for the intended feeding direction for this additive on safety. And then you see there are different points awarded for different steps. If you notify, if a manufacturer notifies the FDA, you get more points than, for example, if there is no submission. If there is no GRAS conclusion and there is no FDA review, that's a minimum requirement of safety that's not met. And so that's basically something that cannot be fed. And then you have your final question about the instructions for handling storage conditions and any cautions or warnings for use. You're going to notice that all of them have a legend that basically talk about high, moderate, or limited confidence, basically. Okay, so very simple. Depending on the amount of points, then you can just use that legend to figure out how you feel about the safety of a particular product. This one is on mitigation efficacy. And so, like I said before, it depends on the collective body of evidence, and all study types play a role in establishing not only the safety, but also this dose-response relationship. And so there are two questions, basically. And the questions relate to the publicly available evidence supporting that the effect. And then the second one is about what type of evidence exists, what type of studies exist. So fairly simple. You can get anywhere between 0 and 5 points. And once again, it's either high, moderate, or limited. And then finally, the trade-offs and benefits that focuses on the positive return on investment being an economic priority, points out the element that you don't want to have undesirable impacts. And so the questions here are mostly about milk volume, composition, flavor, and aroma, and reproductive health. And you have, a number of options there that award different points, same kind of thing, high, moderate, and limited. So when you finish at the end, you tally up all your points, and then you use the legend, but most importantly, you figure out if this meets your required standards for usage, because everybody's going to have a little bit of a different risk tolerance. Here's where the tool finishes and where some of the leftover elements pick up: the best practices and research gaps. So not all of the insights ended up in tool questions, because, we're not even ready for some of them, right? How do we address some of these insights that popped up from this process? And so we developed best practices. Some of them that we listed, in fact, 3 of them, are best practices that are currently available. So for example, GRAS notification to FDA is recommended best practice to encourage transparency and manage risk. Safe handling directions for feed additives should be provided and easily accessible to all intended users and handlers to maintain worker safety. Feed additives should be reevaluated for use as new scientific evidence becomes available to increase confidence. So these are things that we have available. These are practices that we have currently available, and we are recommending those practices. And you can see the insights there that contribute to those practices. But we have a longer list of best practices that are recommended for development by dairy value chain stakeholders. So let's take a little bit of time on this. First of all, we believe that it's necessary for the value chain to develop and follow shared guidelines to qualify the evidence available for each additive. So we want to reach certain standards for what is the strength of evidence. And that comes from those insights, 4, 5, 11, and 12. The second one is that we need to develop and follow recommendations for accurately measuring the potential impacts of feed additive mitigants on economic performance, because this economic performance is so critical for both understanding trade-offs and benefits and also therefore driving adoption. The next one is that we need to align on and develop a dynamic economic model or evaluation tool. In order to service the previous best practice, you need to actually do the numbers. Modeling and economic evaluation tools are critical for that. We need to align and create an environment for equitable environmental marketplace development. Those particular insights, 9, 11, and 12, talked about how creating these potential new revenue sources are a result of collaborative work by multiple actors. It's not just one actor that's creating the value, and therefore we need to understand how is that going to affect the marketplace development. The next one is identifying and sharing the challenges and barriers to adoption across all the subsectors. That's pretty straightforward. Like I mentioned, there are a number of barriers, and they need to be looked at. They need to be named by their name. They need to be defined. And then the final one is that we need to genuinely engage across the value chain to collaborate. And we used, the Innovation Center for US Dairy as an example, but it's just an example. There are other venues as well out there where collaboration like this could happen. If anybody has any other questions, any other comments, please feel free to reach out to me by email or even give me a call. Thank you so much again, and thanks for your attention today and for your valuable comments today. Have a good day.